I can still remember that night, as if it happened just yesterday. It was one of those evenings where everything feels a little off, like the air around you is charged with something unseen but undeniable. I was home alone, which wasn't unusual. My place is in a pretty quiet neighborhood, the kind where nothing ever really happens. But that night, things were different. It was late, maybe around 11 or 12, the kind of late where the world starts to fall asleep, and you can hear every creak in the house, every rustle of leaves outside. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, not really paying attention to anything specific. It was just one of those nights where I was killing time before bed, nothing on my mind. The lights in the living room were dim, casting long shadows on the walls, and outside, the wind was picking up. I could hear it moving through the trees, rattling the windows ever so slightly. At some point, I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. You know how your brain sometimes registers something before you do? That's exactly how it felt. I glanced up from my phone, not really expecting to see anything, but then I saw him. There was a man standing outside my window. I froze. He was standing so still, as if he had been there for a while, just watching. But that wasn't the worst part. He was wearing this mask, one of those grotesque clown masks, the kind with exaggerated features, bright colors, and a permanent, twisted grin. I could see it so clearly, even through the faint glow from the streetlights filtering through the curtains. His eyes were black, just empty holes staring straight at me, and he was holding something in his hand, a long, thin object like a crowbar or maybe a knife. I couldn't tell from where I was sitting, but the thought sent a cold wave of fear crashing over me. My heart started pounding in my chest, hard enough that I swear I could hear it. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It was like my body had locked up in pure terror. The air in the room felt thicker, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating. I couldn't think straight. All I could do was stare back at him, my mind racing with a million thoughts, but none of them making sense. And then he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his finger to his lips. Shh! That single motion was more terrifying than anything else. It wasn't just that he was there. It was the way he was trying to control the situation. He wanted me to be quiet, to stay frozen in my fear. And I couldn't do anything but obey. I don't know how long we stayed like that. It felt like an eternity. Every second stretched out, the tension in the air growing thicker, suffocating. My mind was screaming at me to move, to do something, but my body refused to cooperate. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own home with this thing watching me from just outside the window. I couldn't take my eyes off the weapon in his hand. It gleamed slightly in the dim light, a cold and threatening presence that made my skin crawl. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that this wasn't happening, but the pounding in my chest was too real, too visceral to ignore. Then, almost as if he could sense my growing panic, he took a step closer to the window. I swear my heart stopped. The way he moved, slow and deliberate, like he knew exactly how much power he held over me, it was suffocating. I tried to back away, to put some distance between us, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I could barely breathe, let alone move. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. Why was he here? What did he want? And why wasn't I doing anything to stop him? I glanced around the room, searching for something, anything, that I could use to protect myself. But the living room felt suddenly foreign, like I had stepped into a nightmare version of my own home. Every shadow seemed to twist and move, mocking my helplessness. I thought about calling the police, but my phone was still in my hand, useless. If I made a move for it, would he notice? Would that be the moment he decided to break in, to attack? The thought was paralyzing. I could already picture him crashing through the glass, that weapon raised high, ready to strike. Suddenly, he tilted his head, as if listening for something. The motion was so subtle, but it sent a fresh wave of terror through me. What was he waiting for? Was there someone else outside, someone I couldn't see? The thought made my blood run cold. I was trapped, alone, and completely at his mercy. And then, he turned and walked away. Just like that, he was gone. One second he was there, staring me down through the window, and the next, he was walking back into the darkness. I didn't move for what felt like hours, my eyes glued to the spot where he had been. My heart was still racing, my breath shallow and uneven. Was it over? Had he left for good? Or was this some kind of sick game? I finally mustered the courage to stand, my legs trembling beneath me as I moved toward the window. Slowly, I peeked through the curtains, half expecting him to be standing there, waiting for me. But there was nothing. Just the empty yard, the wind rustling through the trees, and the faint glow of the streetlights. I should have felt relieved, but something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. Why had he been there? Why hadn't he tried to break in, or worse? The questions swirled around in my mind, but I couldn't find any answers. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there, fast. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, my heart still pounding in my chest. But as I reached for the doorknob, I froze. There, on the other side of the door, was a note, a single piece of paper taped to the wood. My hands were shaking as I pulled it off and unfolded it, my eyes scanning the words written in a messy, almost childlike scrawl. "I'll be back." That's all it said. Just 3 words, simple but loaded with a chilling promise. I dropped the note and stumbled back, my mind reeling. He wasn't gone. This wasn't over. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every sound, every creak of the house made my skin crawl. I sat on the couch, clutching a kitchen knife in my hand, my eyes glued to the windows, waiting for him to return. But the hours dragged on, and nothing happened. The sun finally came up, casting long shadows across the floor, but it didn't bring any comfort. The note was still there, sitting on the floor like a ticking time bomb. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I mean, who would believe me? It sounds crazy, like something out of a bad horror movie. But I know what I saw, and I know he's out there, waiting. And that's the worst part. It's not knowing when he'll come back, or what he'll do when he does. It's the waiting, the constant fear gnawing at the back of my mind. Every night, I wonder if tonight will be the night. Every shadow outside my window looks a little too much like a man in a clown mask. The days that followed were torture. Every little thing set me on edge, like I was living in a state of constant, suffocating paranoia. Even during the day, when everything should have felt safe, I found myself jumping at the smallest noises. Footsteps outside, the hum of a car engine as someone drove by, or even just the sound of the mail dropping through the slot. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there, watching, waiting. At night, though, it was the worst. I'd lie awake in bed, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. The house, which used to be my sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Every creak, every groan of the floorboards made me wonder if he had somehow found a way inside. More than once, I thought about leaving, just packing up and going to stay with a friend or checking into a hotel somewhere. But part of me was too scared to even do that. What if he followed me? What if it didn't matter where I went? After a few days of this, I finally decided I had to do something. Sitting around, waiting for him to make the next move, was driving me insane. So, I went to the police. I told them everything, well, almost everything. I left out the part about the clown mask, because let's be real, that sounded completely nuts. I just said there was a man outside my window watching me, and that he left a note saying he'd come back. They listened, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. They said they'd send someone to drive by the house a few times at night just to be safe, but there wasn't much else they could do. Without any real evidence, it was just my word against nothing. I left the station feeling frustrated, like I hadn't accomplished anything. And worse, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. A week passed and nothing happened. No more notes, no more sightings. Gradually, I started to convince myself that maybe it was over, that maybe he had moved on, or that maybe, just maybe, it had all been some kind of elaborate prank. The logical part of my brain kept trying to find explanations. Maybe it was just some weirdo looking to scare me, and now that he'd done it, he was finished. Or maybe he'd targeted someone else. The thought gave me a sick sort of relief, but it didn't last long. One evening, I came home from work, trying to settle back into my routine. I was tired, and the stress of the last week had worn me down. I remember thinking that maybe I'd finally be able to get a good night's sleep. I threw my keys on the kitchen counter and started heating up some leftovers for dinner. The house was quiet, the familiar hum of the fridge and the soft ticking of the wall clock giving me some semblance of normalcy. I was beginning to relax just a little when I noticed something. The window. There was something different about it, something off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, but as I walked closer, my heart began to race. And then I saw it. There, just barely visible, was the faint outline of a smudged handprint. It was on the outside, pressed against the glass, like someone had been standing right there, staring in again. The terror came flooding back all at once, crashing over me like a wave. My mouth went dry, and my hands started shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the plate I was holding. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, just staring at that handprint, trying to process what it meant. He had been here again. I didn't know when, but it didn't matter. The point was, he hadn't forgotten about me. He was still watching. My mind was racing. Should I call the police again? Would they even take me seriously this time? Or would they brush it off as another overreaction? My thoughts were spiraling, and before I could stop myself, I rushed to the front door, locking it, double-checking every window, every possible entry point. I needed to make sure he couldn't get in, not this time. But then, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a side effect of the panic. But it was real. It was coming from somewhere near the back of the house. Slowly, cautiously, I made my way down the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate, until I reached the back door. And there, through the frosted glass pane, I saw him. The same twisted, grinning clown mask, the same dark, hollow eyes. He was standing there, just on the other side of the door, his face pressed close to the glass. He was tapping on it with the tip of his knife, because this time, there was no mistaking it. The light from the kitchen caught the edge of the blade, making it glint in the darkness. My stomach dropped. He was taunting me, letting me know that he could get as close as he wanted, whenever he wanted, and I couldn't stop him. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice was stuck in my throat. The only thing I could do was back away, step by step, until I felt the cold wall of the hallway behind me. He stayed there, motionless, except for the slow, deliberate tapping of the knife against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Each tap felt like it was echoing through my skull, louder and louder, until I thought I would lose my mind. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he stopped. He tilted his head again, like he had done that first night, and then he stepped back, disappearing into the shadows. I waited, barely daring to breathe, half expecting him to come crashing through the door any second. But he didn't. Instead, after what felt like hours, I heard something else, a soft rustling sound, like paper being slipped under the door. I stood there, frozen, my body refusing to move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to walk forward, my legs trembling beneath me. There was another note, lying on the floor just inside the door. I didn't want to read it. I didn't want to know what it said, but I had to. Slowly, I unfolded the piece of paper, my fingers trembling. "I'm closer than you think." That's all it said. I dropped the note and stumbled back, my mind reeling with the implications. He wasn't just watching me from outside. He was inside my head, inside my life, closer than I could ever imagine. And worst of all, I had no idea what he was planning to do next. The police didn't believe me the first time, and I knew they wouldn't believe me now. But I could feel it. The walls closing in, the air growing heavier with every passing minute. He was playing a game, and I was the prize. There was no telling when he would make his next move, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't safe. Not anymore, and neither was anyone else. That was the last night I spent in that house. I packed a bag, left everything behind, and never looked back. But even now, no matter where I go, I still feel his eyes on me. It started out so innocently. I was at a local coffee shop, nothing special, just another Saturday afternoon. I had been scrolling through my phone, sipping on an iced latte when a guy, mid-30s, clean-shaven, kind of average, approached my table. He asked if the seat across from me was taken. He didn't seem threatening, and I figured, what's the harm? It was just coffee, right? We chatted for a bit, small talk mostly. His name was Daniel, and he seemed friendly, polite even. He wasn't overly pushy, and I appreciated that. He asked about my job, my hobbies, nothing too personal. It was one of those casual conversations you forget about the moment you leave. But when I was about to head out, he asked for my number. Normally, I would have made up an excuse, but something about the way he asked, it was almost shy, like he was nervous. So, against my better judgment, I gave it to him. I didn't think much of it at the time. That night, he sent me a text, a simple message. "Hey, it was nice meeting you. Hope we can grab coffee again sometime." It didn't seem weird at first, so I responded, something polite like, "Yeah, sure. It was nice to meet you too." But then the text kept coming. The next day there was a good morning message, and by the afternoon, another asking how my day was going. By the end of the day, he'd sent over 10 texts, each one more eager than the last. It was strange, but I figured he was just overly excited. I wasn't that interested, so I didn't reply to every single one, but I thought maybe he'd take the hint if I didn't engage much. By the third day, things got uncomfortable. It was around lunchtime when my phone buzzed again. This time there were 2 missed calls from him, followed by a message that made my stomach drop. It read, "Why aren't you answering? I know you're not that busy." I stared at my phone, a knot forming in my gut. That wasn't the casual, flirty tone from before. Something about the way he said it felt wrong, invasive. I didn't respond, and for the rest of the day, I tried to push it out of my mind. But the messages kept coming, more frequent, more demanding. "I saw you were online earlier. Why didn't you text me back? I thought we had a connection. Why are you ignoring me?" By the end of that evening, he had sent over 40 messages. I didn't respond to any of them. I blocked his number, hoping that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to find more missed calls, but from a different number. Then came the texts again. He had somehow found another way to reach me. This time, the messages were even more unsettling. He sent me a picture of the coffee shop where we met. Just the coffee shop, taken from outside, as if he was standing right there. No caption, nothing else, just the photo. My hands were shaking as I looked at the screen. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe he lived near the coffee shop. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I decided to ignore it, figuring if I didn't give him any attention, he'd stop. But he didn't. Throughout the day, the messages kept coming, always from different numbers. First, it was simple texts. "Why are you ignoring me?" Then they became more aggressive. "You think you're too good to talk to me now? You're making a mistake." That evening, he called me again, this time from yet another number. I didn't pick up, but he left a voicemail. His voice was calm, too calm, like he wasn't even upset. But the words he said sent chills down my spine. "You shouldn't ignore people like that. It's rude. I just want to talk. We had a good time, didn't we?" I blocked that number too, but it didn't stop him. Every time I blocked one, another appeared. Each message, each call chipped away at my sense of security. I started to feel like I was being watched, even when I was alone in my apartment. A few days passed, and the texts became less frequent, and I hoped, it was finally over. But then, one night, I received something different. It wasn't a text this time, it was a video. The message came from an unknown number, and I almost didn't open it. But curiosity got the better of me. I tapped on the screen, and the video began to play. It was footage of me, walking down the street. It looked like it had been taken from inside a car, following me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He had been watching me, following me. I couldn't breathe. My pulse pounded in my ears as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. How long had he been following me? How many times had I walked down that street, oblivious to the fact that someone was filming me? That's when I started to panic. This wasn't just some guy sending too many texts. This was something else, something dangerous. I didn't know what to do. Should I go to the police? But what could they do? He hadn't made any direct threats, hadn't hurt me. It was all so subtle, so manipulative. I called my best friend, Kara, that night. I was practically shaking as I explained everything to her. She listened, her voice calm but concerned. "You need to go to the police, Emily," she said. "Even if he hasn't threatened you, you need to report this. You need to document everything." She was right. I knew she was right, but part of me was terrified of escalating things. What if reporting him made him angrier? What if he did something worse? Still, I knew I couldn't handle this alone. The next day, I went to the police station. I explained everything to the officer at the desk, how I met him, how he wouldn't stop texting or calling, how he was following me now. They took down my statement. And while they were sympathetic, it didn't feel like they really understood the gravity of the situation. They told me to keep collecting evidence, to document every text, every call. They said they'd look into it, but without a direct threat, there wasn't much they could do. I left the station feeling deflated. That night, I didn't sleep. Every little sound in the apartment made me jump. I felt trapped, constantly on edge, waiting for the next message, the next call. And sure enough, it came. Another text, another number. This time, the message was simple. Why did you go to the police? My blood ran cold. How did he know? Had he been following me there? Was he watching me now? I rushed to the window, pulling the curtains shut, my heart racing in my chest. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was something darker, something far more sinister. He knew where I lived. He knew where I went. There was no escape from him. The messages kept coming that night, each one more cryptic than the last. You can't hide from me. I see you. We're connected now. You can't just cut me off. I didn't respond. I couldn't. But the fear was paralyzing. I thought about changing my number, but something in me resisted. Kara's words echoed in my mind. You need to document everything. If I changed my number, I'd lose the evidence, and if things got worse, I needed proof. The next day, Kara came over to stay with me. I was too scared to be alone, and having her there brought some comfort. But even with her there, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped into my throat. Kara told me to turn it off, but I couldn't. I needed to know what he was saying, what he was planning. And then one night, the messages stopped. For a full day, there was nothing. No texts, no calls, no videos. I should have felt relieved, but instead, the silence was even more terrifying. It was like the calm before the storm, and I didn't know what was coming next. The next night, as Kara and I sat in the living room trying to distract ourselves with a movie, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a text, it was a live video call. The number was blocked. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Kara looked at me, her eyes wide. Don't answer it, she said, her voice tense. But I couldn't help myself. My thumb hovered over the screen, and before I could stop myself, I tapped accept. The screen went black for a moment, and then the image came into focus. It was a live feed of the outside of my apartment. I could see the street, the cars parked along the curb, and then the camera started moving. It was walking, getting closer and closer to my building. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was seeing. He was here. Outside. Right now. I dropped the phone, my hands trembling. Kara grabbed it, her face pale. Kara grabbed the phone, her face going pale as she looked at the live feed. "Oh my God, Emily," she whispered. "He's right outside." I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, like all the air had been sucked out of the room. The walls of my apartment, once comforting and familiar, now felt like a trap, closing in on me. My thoughts were racing, but I couldn't grab onto any one of them long enough to make sense of what was happening. All I knew was that he was outside, right now, and I had no idea what he was going to do next. Kara, always the more rational one, snapped into action. She locked the door, bolted it, and pulled the curtains closed, her movements quick and precise. "We need to call the police. Right now." She was right. I knew she was right. But I still couldn't shake the fear that reporting him would make things worse. What if he knew we were calling the police? What if that made him do something more drastic? I looked down at my phone, the live feed still playing. The camera was getting closer and closer to the entrance of my building. He was coming. "We don't have time to think about this," Kara urged, grabbing her phone and dialing 911 before I could even respond. I could hear her talking to the operator, her voice steady, but I wasn't listening to what she said. My eyes were glued to my screen. The feed stopped, just outside the front door of the building. The view shifted slightly, and then the camera zoomed in on the door. He was here. My stomach lurched, and suddenly, all I could think about was escape. I ran to the back of the apartment, into my bedroom, yanking open the window. I knew it was crazy, but the thought of being trapped in the apartment while he was just downstairs was unbearable. Kara rushed in after me, still on the phone with the police. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice tinged with panic. "They said to stay inside and lock everything." "I can't just stay here," I cried, my voice shaking. "He's downstairs. Kara, he's downstairs." Before Kara could argue, We both heard it. A knock. Not on the front door of the building, but on my apartment door. 3 loud, deliberate knocks, each one echoing through the silence like a death sentence. We froze. There was no way he could have gotten in. The building was secure. You needed a key to get inside, or at least be buzzed in. But somehow, some way, he had made it to my door. Kara put a hand over the phone's speaker, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Emily, he's here." I could feel the panic rising inside me like a wave, threatening to drown me. The knocks came again, louder this time, more insistent. I backed away from the door, shaking my head in disbelief. How had he gotten in? How had he found me? The knocking stopped. For a brief second there was silence. But then we heard something even worse. The sound of something being slid under the door. Slowly, cautiously, Kara and I approached the front door. My hands were trembling, my breath shallow. I didn't want to know what was on the other side, but I had to look. I knelt down, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst, and I saw it. A single piece of paper, folded neatly, just like the notes before. With trembling hands, I picked it up, unfolding it as Kara watched, her eyes wide with fear. The words were scrawled in the same messy handwriting as the others, but this time they were even more chilling. "You can't hide from me. I'll always find you." I dropped the note, my legs giving out beneath me. Kara grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "The police are on their way. We just have to hold on a little longer. Don't open the door, no matter what happens." But just as she said that, the door handle rattled. The sound was so sudden, so sharp, that I nearly screamed. I could see the handle moving, slowly, as if someone was testing it, trying to figure out if it was locked. Then came another knock, softer this time, almost polite. "Emily," a voice called through the door. His voice, calm, steady, as if this was just another one of his texts. "I just want to talk." I pressed my hand over my mouth, trying to stifle the sob that was threatening to escape. Kara was already pulling me back, dragging me into the living room. She grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, her face pale and tense. "Emily, I know you're in there. Just open the door. We can work this out." His voice sent chills down my spine. It was like he was right next to me, whispering in my ear. I couldn't believe this was happening. How had I let it get this far? It had started with a simple coffee date, just one casual meeting, and now he was at my door trying to break in. The handle rattled again, more forcefully this time, and then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of a key sliding into the lock. Kara's eyes went wide. No way. How does he have a key? The lock clicked. For a split second, everything seemed to slow down. Kara rushed to the door, throwing her weight against it as the knob turned. The chair under the doorknob was barely holding. He was pushing against the door, trying to get in. I stood there, frozen in disbelief. How had he gotten a key? Had he been watching me all this time, waiting for the right moment to make his move? "Kara, he's gonna break in!" I yelled, my voice finally finding its strength. She was leaning all her weight against the door, but it was clear that it wouldn't hold much longer. "Call the police back!" Kara shouted, her voice strained. "Tell them to get here faster!" I grabbed my phone, frantically dialing the number. As I pressed it to my ear, the door creaked under the pressure, the chair wobbling. My heart was in my throat as the operator answered. "They're coming," the woman said calmly, but I could hear the tension in her voice. "They'll be there any minute. Just stay on the line with me." But I didn't know if we had a minute. Suddenly, the pressure on the door stopped. The rattling ceased, and everything went quiet. Kara and I exchanged confused, terrified glances. The silence was deafening. Was he still there? Was he waiting for us to make a move? We waited, holding our breath, listening for any sound, any clue of what he might do next. And then, there it was. A faint sound like footsteps retreating down the hallway. Had he given up? Was he leaving? I didn't dare move, too afraid to believe it was over. But Kara, braver than me, slowly peered through the peephole. After a long moment, she let out a shaky breath. "He's gone," she whispered, stepping back from the door. "Emily, he's gone." I didn't believe her. I couldn't. But the tension in the air was lifting, just slightly. The door was still intact, the lock holding, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I let myself breathe. Just then, we heard the sound of sirens approaching, getting closer and closer. Relief washed over me, and I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face. Kara knelt beside me, her arms around my shoulders, holding me tightly. The police arrived moments later, pounding on the door, identifying themselves. We let them in, and as they checked the building, searching for any sign of him, I felt a strange mixture of relief and fear. He was gone, but the feeling of dread lingered. They never found him. No sign of him anywhere. He had vanished as quickly as he had appeared, leaving no trace except for the key and that note. I never saw him again, but even now, months later, I still feel like he's out there, watching, waiting, because people like him, they never really go away. I remember everything about that night. It's strange how something can cling to your mind, how certain moments refuse to fade no matter how much time passes. And this story, well, it's haunted me for years. It started out innocently enough. Just a group of friends hanging out, trying to pass the time. There were 5 of us, me, Jake, Sarah, Matt, and Lisa. We grew up in this small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business. So when people started going missing, it wasn't long before the rumors started spreading. It was mostly older folks, people who had lived in the town for years, even decades, just vanishing. No explanation, no trace. At first, we didn't think much of it. It's easy to ignore things that don't directly affect you. But when old Mr. Cooper disappeared, something shifted. He lived just a few houses down from Sarah's place, and she'd known him her whole life. She swore up and down that something about his disappearance didn't add up. We'd all heard the stories growing up, about the woods on the edge of town, about how people went in and never came out. Kids talked about it like some sort of urban legend. But when people actually started disappearing, the legend felt real, too real. So of course we decided to do something incredibly stupid. We thought we could figure out what was going on. We thought we could be heroes. We met at Jake's place one evening, just after sunset. The air had that crisp, autumn chill to it, the kind that makes your breath visible, even when you're trying to act tough. I remember Lisa rubbing her arms, trying to stay warm, and Matt, ever the joker, tossing her his jacket. But there was something in the air that night, something different. Even the usual banter among the group felt strained. We tried to act normal, but there was this underlying tension, like we all knew we were about to do something we couldn't come back from. We headed toward the woods, armed with nothing more than flashlights and our phones. Looking back, it was ridiculous. What were we thinking? But at the time, it felt like an adventure. We were young, and nothing bad ever really happens, right? The entrance to the woods was darker than I remembered. I don't know why, but it felt wrong. The trees seemed to close in around us as we stepped off the main road and onto the narrow path that cut through the forest. The wind had picked up by then, rustling the leaves and sending cold shivers down my spine. I told myself it was just the weather, but deep down I felt it was something else. Something was watching us. I could feel it. For the first few minutes, we tried to keep the mood light. Matt kept making jokes, trying to ease the tension, but no one really laughed. The deeper we went, the quieter we became. Even the usual sounds of the forest, crickets, distant animals, seemed to vanish. It was like the woods had swallowed all the noise. And then we found it. At first, it just looked like an old cabin, run down, half hidden beneath overgrown vines and moss. Jake was the one who spotted it. "Guys, over here," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. We gathered around, shining our flashlights on the structure. It was ancient. The wood was rotting, the windows were broken, and the door hung on its hinges like it hadn't been used in years. It shouldn't have been surprising. There were a lot of abandoned buildings in the area, left over from when the town was more populated. But something about this place, it didn't feel right. "Let's check it out," Sarah said, already moving toward the door. "Wait," I said, grabbing her arm. "Are we sure about this?" She looked at me with that determined expression she always had when she made up her mind. "We're here to find answers, right? This is the first real lead we've had." Reluctantly, I let go, and we all followed her inside. The air inside the cabin was cold, colder than it should have been. It smelled of damp wood and something else, something metallic. Blood? I tried to shake off the thought. There was a fireplace on one side, though it hadn't been used in who knows how long, and a table in the center of the room. Papers were scattered everywhere, yellowed with age, but none of us paid much attention to them. Our eyes were all drawn to the far corner, where a man sat slumped against the wall. He was old, maybe in his 60s or 70s, but his clothes were tattered and his face was gaunt, like he hadn't eaten in days. He didn't look up when we entered. For a second, I thought he was dead, but then I saw the faint rise and fall of his chest. He was breathing. "Hello," Lisa said cautiously, taking a step closer. The man didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the floor. "Hey, are you okay?" Jake asked, moving to stand next to him. He knelt down, putting a hand on the man's shoulder, and that's when the old man finally reacted. His head snapped up, and I'll never forget the look in his eyes. They were wide, terrified, like he'd seen something unimaginable. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What happened to you?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you Mr. Cooper?" The man didn't answer at first. He just kept shaking his head, muttering to himself. Then, finally, he looked directly at us. "It's too late," he said, his voice hollow. "I tried to stop it, but it's too late." We exchanged nervous glances. "What's too late?" Matt asked. The old man let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You're all part of it now." Before we could ask him anything else, he lunged. It happened so fast that none of us saw it coming. He grabbed a shard of broken glass from the floor and slashed at his own throat. Blood poured out, and I froze, completely paralyzed as I watched him fall back against the wall, his eyes still wide, but now empty. Jake screamed, and Lisa turned away, her hands over her mouth. Matt just stood there, in shock. It was Sarah who snapped out of it first. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice trembling. "Now." We ran. I don't remember much of the run back, just the sound of our feet pounding against the dirt, the wind howling in our ears, and the sheer panic that gripped my chest. We didn't stop until we were back at Jake's house, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. We never told anyone about the cabin or the man. What could we say? That we found a missing person, only for him to kill himself right in front of us? No one would believe us. Hell, I barely believed it myself. But things didn't go back to normal after that. In fact, they got worse. Over the next few weeks, more people started disappearing. It wasn't just the old folks anymore. It was people our age, people we knew. Lisa stopped coming to school. Matt moved away without warning. Sarah started acting strange, distant, like she wasn't really there anymore. And then one night, I woke up to a knock on my window. It was Sarah, standing outside in the cold, her hair tangled and her eyes wild. "It's too late," she whispered, her breath fogging up the glass. "We're all part of it now." That's when I realized, whatever had happened in that cabin, whatever had taken Mr. Cooper, it hadn't stopped with him. It had followed us back, and it wasn't done yet. I'll never forget that night. Even now, years later, the memory of it sticks with me, like a dark cloud that I can't shake off. We had no idea what we were walking into, no clue that we would be fighting for our lives in the middle of nowhere, up against something that should never have existed. It was supposed to be a routine investigation. My team, 4 of us, were all experienced detectives, used to dealing with tough situations. So when we caught wind of a gang operating out of a cave near the cliffs, we didn't think twice about checking it out. We'd heard rumors, whispers about strange things happening in the area, but we chalked that up to local gossip. Small towns like this always had stories of haunted places or strange creatures lurking in the shadows. The first sign that something was off came before we even reached the cave. It was late, just after midnight, and the wind was howling something fierce. The cliffs were known for their sharp drops and rocky edges, but I remember thinking how much colder it felt than it should have. The air had this biting chill to it, almost unnatural. My breath came out in thick white clouds as we trudged along the narrow path, flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. There was a strange stillness, too. Aside from the wind, everything was eerily quiet. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just the sound of our boots crunching on the gravel and the distant roar of the ocean crashing against the cliffs. Every step made me more uneasy, like something was watching us from the shadows. "I don't like this," I muttered, glancing at Jake, our team leader. He was the kind of guy who never let fear get to him. but even he looked tense. His jaw was clenched, and his eyes kept darting to the sides, scanning the darkness. He didn't say anything, just nodded in agreement. Lena, our tech expert, was walking behind me. She was usually the one to break the tension with some sarcastic comment, but tonight, she was quiet, too quiet. I could hear her breathing, shallow and fast, like she was trying to hold back her nerves. And then there was Marcus, bringing up the rear, our muscle, the guy who never flinched in the face of danger. But even he seemed jumpy, his hand resting on his gun, ready to pull it at the first sign of trouble. We reached the cave just after midnight. The entrance was nothing special, just a dark, gaping hole in the side of the cliff, half hidden by overgrown bushes and jagged rocks. It didn't look like much from the outside, but something about it made my skin crawl. There was this smell, this awful, metallic stench, like rust or dried blood. It hung in the air, thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. We had no choice but to go in. The cave was where the gang was supposedly holed up, and we needed to confirm if the rumors were true. But as soon as we stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. We had no choice but to go in. The cave was where the gang was supposedly holed up, and we needed to confirm if the rumors were true. But as soon as we stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. The air was damp and cold, and our flashlights flickered against the slick, wet walls. The deeper we went, the more suffocating the atmosphere became. "Do you hear that?" Lena whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of our footsteps. We all stopped, straining to listen. At first, I thought it was just the wind howling through the cave, but then I heard it, a low, distant hum. It was faint, almost like a vibration, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "What the hell is that?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with tension. Jake held up a hand, signaling us to stay quiet. He motioned for us to move forward, cautiously, weapons drawn. Every step we took seemed to echo louder in the oppressive silence. The hum grew louder the deeper we went, turning into a low rumble that vibrated through the walls of the cave. I felt it in my chest, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. We rounded a corner, and that's when we saw it. A large, open chamber, dimly lit by some kind of eerie, flickering light. The source of the light wasn't clear at first, but what we saw in the middle of the chamber stopped us cold. There, standing in the center of the cave, was a man, tall, gaunt, his face hidden in shadow. He was surrounded by a strange, pulsing glow, like some kind of unnatural aura. He didn't move. He didn't react to us at all. It was like he wasn't even aware we were there. "Is that one of them?" Lena whispered. "I don't know," Jake replied, his voice barely a whisper. "But something's not right." We moved closer, trying to get a better look, but then the hum turned into a deafening roar like the sound of a jet engine. The ground beneath us shook, and suddenly, the figure in the center of the cave moved. Fast. Faster than anything I'd ever seen. Before any of us could react, the thing, it wasn't a man, not anymore, charged at us. I barely had time to raise my weapon before it was on us. I fired, but the bullets didn't even slow it down. They just bounced off like the creature was made of stone or metal. Jake shouted for us to fall back, and we did, scrambling out of the chamber, running as fast as we could. But Marcus wasn't fast enough. The thing caught him, and I heard him scream, a horrible, gut-wrenching sound that I'll never forget. When I looked back, all I saw was a blur of movement and Marcus's lifeless body hitting the cave floor. We didn't stop running until we were out of the cave, back into the freezing night air. My lungs burned, and my heart felt like it was about to explode, but I didn't dare stop. None of us did. We didn't speak until we were halfway down the path, too far from the cave to hear that awful hum. "What the hell was that thing?" Lena gasped, clutching her side as she struggled to catch her breath. "I don't know," Jake said, his face pale and drawn. "But we need to get out of here, now." We didn't argue. We just kept moving, the cold wind biting at our skin, the darkness pressing in on us from all sides. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that thing chasing us, but there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind and our labored breathing. It wasn't until we reached the edge of the forest, back near the road where our car was parked, that we finally stopped. None of us spoke. We didn't need to. The shock of what had just happened was written all over our faces. Marcus was gone, killed by something we couldn't even begin to understand, And whatever it was still out there in that cave, waiting. We never reported what we saw. Who would believe us? A gang of criminals hiding in a cave was one thing, but a creature that defied explanation, that was something else entirely. Jake, Lena, and I went our separate ways after that. None of us stayed on the force for long. The memory of that night, of Marcus's screams, haunted me for years. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that hum, the low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. And every time I do, I wonder if that thing is still out there, waiting for its next victims. That night never really left me. Even now, years later, I can still feel the weight of it pressing down on my chest, as if some invisible force never stopped clinging to me. We never talked about what happened to Marcus. We never reported it, and definitely didn't mention the thing we encountered in that cave. Every time I think back to it, I get this sick feeling in my stomach. It's like there's a darkness that lingers, one that never lets go. Jake, Lena, and I tried to go back to normal after that night, but nothing ever felt right. Jake was the first to quit the force, only a month after everything went down. He left town without so much as an explanation. I didn't blame him. How could you live like nothing happened when you knew that something unnatural was out there, watching? Lena and I kept in touch for a while, but even she started to pull away. After a few awkward phone calls, she just vanished, cut off all contact. I tried to find her, but it was like she had disappeared, just like Marcus. And then there was me. I stayed, tried to pretend it was all behind us. I left the police work, got an office job, and avoided anything that had to do with investigations. But no matter how hard I tried to bury it, the memories of that cave crept back into my mind. Every night I'd close my eyes and I'd see Marcus lying there, bleeding out, the thing looming over him, unstoppable. I couldn't shake it, no matter how hard I tried. Then one night, when I thought the worst was finally behind me, my phone rang. It was 3 a.m., one of those calls that never brings good news. My hand shook as I picked up the phone, my voice groggy and thick with sleep. "Hello?" There was no response at first, just heavy breathing on the other end. Instantly, my stomach dropped. Something wasn't right. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. For a long moment, there was silence. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, but I recognized the voice immediately. It was Lena. "We made a mistake," she whispered, her voice shaky, like she hadn't slept in days. "It's not over. It's watching me." I shot up in bed, my heart racing. "Lena, where are you?" "No one's safe," she continued, ignoring my question. I thought I could outrun it, but I was wrong. I can hear it, like before. "In the cave, it's..." Then the line went dead. I sat there in the darkness, clutching the phone, but all I could hear was the empty hum of the disconnected call. Panic clawed at my throat. Lena had been missing for months, and now, out of nowhere, she calls me in the middle of the night, talking about it, the thing we had all tried to forget. I couldn't just sit there. Without thinking, I threw on some clothes and jumped into my car, speeding toward the town where Lena used to live. The roads were deserted, and the only sound was the hum of my tires on the pavement. Every shadow on the road felt like it was closing in, and the deeper I drove into the night, the more that creeping dread took over. When I finally reached Lena's place, everything was dark. Her front door was locked, but I still had a spare key she'd given me years ago. The second I stepped inside, I felt the cold hit me like a wave. The house was freezing, unnaturally so. "Lena?" I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. No answer. The house felt empty. Then I heard it. That sound. A low, thrumming noise like something vibrating deep in the ground just beneath the surface. My blood ran cold. It was the same sound we heard in the cave that night, the same hum that signaled its presence. I turned, and there she was. Lena, standing in the dark, her frame thin and frail. Her eyes were wide, hollow, and filled with terror. "It's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Before I could even react, the window behind her shattered, and the freezing air rushed in, sending shards of glass flying across the room. I didn't need to see it to know what had come. But this time, I saw it clearly. The thing that had hunted us down, the creature that defied all reason and logic, was right there. Its massive, distorted form moving through the broken window with terrifying speed. Its skin was rough and mottled, like the surface of a boulder, and its eyes, those red glowing eyes, locked onto Lena. I tried to move. I wanted to scream, to pull her away, but it was too late. The creature moved faster than I ever thought possible. Lena let out a strangled scream as it lunged at her, and in an instant she was gone, ripped from the room, disappearing into the night. It all happened so fast that it felt like a dream, and then the silence returned. The room was empty again. Lena was gone, like Marcus before her, vanished into the darkness as though she had never existed. I was alone. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stood there, frozen in place. The house was quiet now, eerily still, and in the distance I could still hear that hum, the same hum that had haunted me ever since that night in the cave. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually my legs moved on their own, carrying me out of the house and into the cold night air. I looked around, half expecting the creature to come back for me, but the street was deserted, the only sound the distant rustling of the wind. I don't know where Lena went, or if she's still out there. But one thing is for sure, whatever we encountered that night in the cave, it never stopped hunting us. And I know, deep down, that it's only a matter of time before it finds me too. I still remember that Halloween night like it was yesterday. You never forget things like this. They get stuck in your mind, haunting you at odd times when you least expect it. The memory of it still sends chills down my spine, and even now, I can't help but wonder if it was all real or just some terrible dream. But deep down, I know the truth. It started out like any other Halloween. My daughter, Chrissy, she's 8, bright as a button, always full of life, had been talking about trick-or-treating for weeks. She couldn't wait. We had spent the entire afternoon getting her costume ready, but we were still missing one thing, a mask. Chrissy was very particular about it. She didn't want just any old mask, you know? She wanted something special. And I wanted to make her happy, so we went to this small second-hand shop down the street. The kind of place that's a little rundown, cluttered with random odds and ends, but where you can find something unique if you look hard enough. The moment we walked in, Chrissy's eyes lit up. She darted around the shop, checking out old costumes, dusty toys, and faded decorations. But then she found it, the mask. It was a witch mask, but not one of those cheap plastic ones. This one looked different. It was made of some kind of thick, rubbery material with deep wrinkles etched into the face, like it had been worn for centuries. The eyes were hollow, just empty black holes, and the mouth was twisted into a crooked, unsettling smile. It gave me the creeps just looking at it, but Chrissy, she loved it. "I want this one, Mom," she exclaimed, holding it up to her face. The moment she put it on, I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I shook it off. Kids love spooky things on Halloween, right? And it's just a mask. What harm could it do? I paid for it, and we left. At first, everything seemed fine. Chrissy was excited, practically bouncing up and down the sidewalk as we went from house to house collecting candy. She wore the mask the entire time, laughing and giggling with that innocent joy only kids can have. But after a while, I noticed something different. It's hard to explain, but the way she was moving, her posture, the way her head tilted to the side, it wasn't quite right. Like she was trying to mimic something, or worse, someone. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just the mask making her act silly. Kids get into character, right? But as the night went on, her behavior grew stranger. She stopped talking so much, and her laugh, God, her laugh, it changed. It wasn't her usual giggle anymore. It was low, raspy, almost like a cackle. I remember turning to her, looking at her through the dim streetlights and asking, "Chrissy, are you okay?" She didn't answer. She just stared at me through those hollow eye holes in the mask, the crooked smile seeming to stretch wider. It was then that I noticed something else. We headed home after that, but the whole way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Chrissy didn't talk much anymore, just kept the mask on, quiet, occasionally letting out that strange, rasping laugh. When we got back to the house, I told her it was time to take off the mask, but she refused. "Just a little longer, Mom," she said, her voice muffled behind the mask, sounding different, almost older. I didn't argue at first. I figured she'd get tired of it soon enough. But as the night wore on, she never did. She wore it through dinner, wore it while we watched TV, and finally, when it was time for bed, I had to insist she take it off. "Chrissy, Enough is enough, I said, reaching to pull it off myself. The second my fingers touched the mask, she screamed. I mean, really screamed. This horrible, piercing sound that didn't sound like it could come from a child. She slapped my hand away and bolted to her room, slamming the door behind her. I was left standing there, stunned, my heart pounding in my chest. That wasn't my Chrissy. That wasn't my daughter. I knocked on her door, softly at first, then harder. Chrissy, open up, sweetheart, please. No answer, just silence. I stood there for a long time, my hand hovering over the doorknob, too scared to open it, too scared to see what might be on the other side. After a while, I went to bed, though I barely slept. Every little creak in the house made me jump. Every gust of wind outside sounded like something scratching at the windows. My heart raced all night. The next morning, I woke up to find her sitting at the kitchen table. She was still wearing the mask. I tried to talk to her, tried to get her to eat something, but she just sat there, silently staring at her plate, her fingers twitching slightly. It was like the mask had taken over, like it had sunk into her, changing her. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached out and grabbed the mask, determined to rip it off, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like it was stuck, no, like it was fused to her skin. I pulled harder, and she screamed again, this time in pain. The sound was unbearable. I let go immediately, backing away, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to do. I called the doctor, but what could I say? My daughter's possessed by a Halloween mask? They'd think I was crazy. So, I didn't say anything. I just watched her, helpless, as she grew quieter, more withdrawn, her movements jerky and unnatural. And then the violence started. It was little things at first, slamming doors, knocking over chairs, but soon it escalated. She started breaking things, tearing up her toys, ripping the heads off her dolls, and when I tried to stop her, she turned on me. I'll never forget the look in her eyes that night, the only part of her I could see behind the mask. They were wild, filled with something dark, something that wasn't my little girl. And then the violence started. It was little things at first, slamming doors, knocking over chairs, but soon it escalated. She started breaking things, tearing up her toys, ripping the heads off her dolls, and when I tried to stop her, she turned on me. I'll never forget the look in her eyes that night, the only part of her I could see behind the mask. They were wild, filled with something dark, something that wasn't my little girl. She came at me, swinging her arms wildly, knocking over a lamp and screaming in that awful, raspy voice. I had to call the police. I didn't know what else to do. When they arrived, she was out of control, thrashing around, screaming words I couldn't understand. It took 2 officers to hold her down, and even then, they struggled. They finally managed to pull the mask off. God, the sound it made when they did, like peeling something off that didn't want to come loose. Chrissy collapsed the moment it was off, unconscious, her breathing shallow. The officers left with the mask, though I don't know what they did with it. I never saw it again. Chrissy? She didn't remember a thing, not a single thing. It was like the whole night had been wiped from her memory. She was herself again, happy, sweet, innocent, but I'll never forget. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that laugh, the one that wasn't hers, echoing through the house. And I wonder if the mask is still out there, waiting for someone else to find it. It's strange how someone you barely know can latch onto your life in a way that's so twisted, so suffocating, that it takes over everything. Even now, 12 years later, I still find myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if Lily's there, watching, waiting for her next move. I didn't notice it at first. How could I? It started so small, so innocuous, like the soft hum of background noise you don't even realize is there until it drowns out everything else. We weren't friends, not really. We were in the same class, but that was it. Lily kept to herself, mostly. She wasn't unpopular, but she had this weird energy about her, like she was always observing people, taking mental notes. I guess I was just one of those people she fixated on. The first time I remember her paying attention to me was in sophomore year of high school. I was sitting at lunch with a group of friends when Lily came over and sat down at our table. She didn't say anything, didn't ask to join us, just sat down and stared at me. It was unsettling. I remember glancing at my friend, Emma, who gave me this look like, "Who is this girl?" But I didn't want to be rude, so I smiled at her, asked if she needed something. She just tilted her head, eyes locked on mine, and said, "I just wanted to sit with you." That was it. No explanation. Nothing. It was awkward, but I let it slide. After all, it was just lunch, right? People can be weird sometimes. But after that, things started getting strange. Lily began showing up everywhere I was. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. We had some of the same classes, so it wasn't unusual to see her in the hallways. But then she started popping up at my locker, standing silently a few feet away while I grabbed my books. She was always there, watching, never saying much. I tried to shrug it off, but one day, I got a message from her on Facebook. It was long, really long, talking about how much she admired me, how she thought we had a special connection, how she felt like we were meant to be close. I didn't know what to say. It was weird, right? But I didn't want to be mean. I was raised to be polite, to not cause drama. So I just replied with a simple, "Thanks, that's sweet," and hoped she'd move on. But she didn't. Lily started messaging me constantly. At first, it was just casual things, asking how my day was, talking about school. But then it got more personal. She'd send me these weird, cryptic notes, saying things like, "I know we're meant to be in each other's lives forever," or "I feel like I understand you better than anyone else." I ignored most of them, hoping she'd get the hint, but it only made things worse. She started showing up outside my house. I'd catch glimpses of her down the street, standing on the sidewalk, just staring up at my bedroom window. Sometimes I'd see her in the corner of the coffee shop I liked to go to, pretending to read a book, but always glancing over the pages at me. I tried to tell my friends about it, but they laughed it off. "It's just a crush," Emma had said, rolling her eyes. "She's harmless, maybe a little creepy, but whatever. Harmless." That's what I kept telling myself. But then Lily started getting more intrusive. One afternoon I was home alone, doing homework, when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I looked through the peephole, there she was, Lily, standing on my porch holding a notebook. I didn't want to open the door, but she saw me through the window, so I felt like I had no choice. "Hey, what are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, even though my stomach was in knots. She smiled, that same unsettling smile I'd seen in the cafeteria months ago. "I just wanted to bring you something." She held out the notebook. "It's for you." I hesitated, not wanting to take it, but I didn't want to seem rude. So I took the notebook and thanked her, hoping that would be the end of it. As soon as she left, I opened it up. What I saw made my skin crawl. The entire notebook was filled with pages and pages of notes about me. Detailed, obsessive notes about my daily routine. When I woke up, what I ate for breakfast, who I talked to at school, what clothes I wore, how long I spent at the library. There were even photos of me, taken from a distance, in the park, at school, at home. But the worst part? The last few pages were filled with entries written as if we were in some kind of relationship. She had created this whole fantasy where we were best friends, practically inseparable. In her mind, we spent hours together, shared secrets, laughed, cried, but none of it was true. None of it had ever happened. I felt sick. I wanted to confront her, but at the same time, I was terrified. How do you tell someone that they're invading your life, that their obsession with you is disturbing? So I did the only thing I could think of. I blocked her on Facebook, stopped replying to her messages, avoided her at school, but it didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. She started using fake accounts to follow me on social media, sending me anonymous messages, accusing me of betraying her, of abandoning our friendship. She began spreading lies about me at school, telling people that I was cruel to her, that I had used her and then thrown her away. I lost friends because of it. Emma stopped talking to me altogether, convinced by Lily's manipulative stories. Then she started targeting my boyfriend, Jason. We'd been together for a year by then, and everything was fine, until Lily decided to get involved. She started posting vague, threatening messages online, tagging Jason in bizarre accusatory posts about how he was hurting me, how he was keeping me from my real friends. She even went as far as to claim that he had been unfaithful, spreading rumors around school that he was cheating on me. Jason tried to brush it off, but it started to get to him. People were whispering behind his back, treating him like he was some kind of villain. He got frustrated, angry. We started fighting. That's when Lily would swoop in, sending me messages like, I knew he was bad for you. I'm the only one who really cares about you. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped. No matter how hard I tried to distance myself, Lily was always there, lurking in the shadows, manipulating everything. She had completely taken over my life. One night, after a particularly bad argument with Jason, I got another message from her. It was different this time. There was no accusation, no false sweetness, just three simple words, I'm watching you. That's when I snapped. I called Jason, told him everything about Lily's obsession, the notebook, the stalking, the lies. He listened, but I could hear the disbelief in his voice. Are you sure? He asked. Maybe she's just, I don't know, going through something. I felt like I was losing my mind. No one understood how serious it was, how far Lily had gone. It wasn't just a crush or some weird jealousy. It was an obsession, and it was ruining my life. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak in the house made me jump. Every shadow felt like her. By the morning, I knew what I had to do. I needed to end this, once and for all. I went to the police, showed them the notebook, the messages, everything. They filed a report, but there wasn't much they could do. Lily hadn't physically harmed me, and all the stalking had been subtle enough to stay under the radar. Then one day, Lily disappeared. She didn't show up to school. Her social media accounts went silent. No one saw her for days. I thought it was over, that maybe she'd finally realized how far she had gone and backed off. I almost felt relief. But then, 2 weeks later, I found a letter slipped under my door. It was from Lily. I'll always be watching, it said. No matter where you go, I'll be there. You can't escape me. We're connected. Forever. I moved away after graduation, changed my number, deleted my social media, and tried to start fresh. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that Lily's still out there, watching, waiting. And sometimes when I'm walking home late at night, I feel it. That cold, lingering sensation of eyes on me, following me in the shadows. I'm a mechanic, have been since I could remember. Grew up with grease on my hands, the smell of oil in my nose, and the steady hum of engines in the background. There's a rhythm to it, to fixing things. When a machine breaks, you figure it out, and you fix it. There's a certain peace in that, a kind of control. But the summer Emmy showed up, well, that changed everything. It was the middle of July, hottest time of the year, and business was slow. People were either out of town or staying in, keeping cool. I didn't mind. Less work meant more time for myself, more time to just sit back in the garage and tinker with whatever I wanted. But I noticed something strange happening around town. Not right away, mind you. It was subtle at first. People started acting different, like they weren't themselves. Some were more quiet, others jumpy. At first I chalked it up to the heat. Makes people antsy sometimes, you know? Then came the night I met Emmy. It was a Saturday evening, just after sundown. I was cleaning up the shop, wiping down my tools, locking the place up for the night. The garage sits on the edge of town, right where the road disappears into the woods, and that night the air was heavy, like a storm was brewing but never came. The sky was a dull purple, and the wind, it wasn't strong, but it had this strange bite to it. I remember standing there, just listening to the wind rattle the tin roof of the garage when I heard footsteps. Not hurried, but soft and deliberate. I turned around, and there she was, Emmy. Now, I'd never seen her before, and this town isn't big. Everyone knows everyone. But Emmy, she had this look about her, like she belonged to the place and yet didn't at the same time. She was small, thin, with long black hair that almost reached her waist. Her face was pale, too pale for someone who'd been living in this heat. She wasn't sweating at all, while I was dripping just from being outside for a few minutes. "Are you open?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. No, not really," I replied. "But what do you need?" She told me her car had broken down about half a mile back, and she needed help. Normally I'd have said no, told her to wait until the morning. But there was something about her. I felt drawn to her, like I had to help. I grabbed my toolbox, locked up the shop, and followed her down the road. We didn't talk much as we walked. I tried to make small talk, but she kept her answers short. I remember asking where she was from, and she just said, "Not far from here." Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like she was keeping something back. The air felt colder the closer we got to her car. The wind was still blowing, but it carried a different sound now, a sort of distant whispering, like voices just out of reach. I remember looking around, but the road was empty, nothing but the woods and the darkening sky. When we finally reached her car, I could tell something was off. It wasn't just the car, it was the whole scene. Her car was an old beat-up sedan, the kind you'd see abandoned on the side of the road, but it didn't look like it had been in an accident. There were no skid marks, no signs of damage. It was just sitting there, dead. I popped the hood and started checking the engine, but everything looked fine. Too fine, actually. It didn't make sense. The engine was clean, no wear and tear, nothing out of place. It was like someone had just built the damn thing and dropped it in. But the strangest part? The battery was gone. Not drained, gone. The cables were there, just hanging loose, as if the battery had been ripped out by hand. I stood up, my skin prickling with unease. "Looks like your battery's missing," I said, turning to Emmy. But she wasn't looking at the car. She was staring into the woods, her face unreadable. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I stopped, listened, and there it was again, that whispering sound. But this time it was louder, closer. It wasn't the wind, it was something else, something moving in the trees. "We should go," I said, my heart starting to race. "I'll call a tow truck in the morning." But she didn't move, she just kept staring into the darkness. "They're coming," she said softly. "They're always watching." Before I could ask what the hell she was talking about, I heard it, rustling, like something big was moving through the brush. And then I saw it. Just for a second, out of the corner of my eye. Something pale, moving between the trees. It wasn't an animal, it was too tall, too human. But its movements were wrong, jerky, like it didn't quite understand how to walk. My stomach twisted, and I grabbed Emmy's arm. "We need to go, now." We started back toward the garage, moving fast. I didn't look back, but I could hear them, those things, moving in the woods, keeping pace with us. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, like dozens of voices overlapping, all speaking at once, but I couldn't understand a word. It was like they were talking in some language I'd never heard before. By the time we reached the garage, I was sweating bullets, my heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the door shut behind us and locked it, breathing hard. Emmy stood by the window, watching the road, her face still calm, like none of this bothered her at all. "What the hell were those things?" I asked, my voice shaking. "They're not from here," she said quietly. "They come from somewhere else. They've been following me for a long time." I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, trying to make sense of it all. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. People don't just get followed by whatever those things were. "Why are they after you?" I finally asked. She turned to me, her eyes dark and serious. "Because I don't belong here." Before I could ask what she meant, the lights in the garage flickered and went out. The hum of the electricity died, and we were plunged into darkness. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. Then came the tapping. It started soft, like someone gently knocking on the metal door. But it grew louder, more insistent, like a dozen hands were slapping against the walls of the garage. I could hear them, moving around the building, circling us. Emmy didn't move. She just stood there, staring into the dark. "Stay here," she whispered. "Don't make a sound." And then, before I could stop her, she opened the door and stepped outside. "Emmy," I hissed, but she was gone. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. I pressed myself against the wall, my hands shaking, waiting for something, anything. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Then, without warning, the door creaked open, and she stepped back inside. "They're gone," she said, her voice flat. I stared at her, my mind racing. "What did you do?" She didn't answer. Just gave me this sad little smile like she knew something I didn't. That night, I didn't sleep. How could I? I sat in the garage, listening to the wind, waiting for those things to come back. But they never did. And when the sun finally rose, Emmy was gone. No trace of her. No footprints, no sign that she'd ever been there at all. It was like she'd just vanished. I don't know what happened that summer. I still can't explain it, but things have never been the same around here. People went missing after that, a few at first, then more. The town got quieter, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something bad to happen. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear that whispering. A week after Emmy disappeared, the first body was found. It was a local kid, maybe 15 or 16. Name was Benny. They found him in the woods not far from where Emmy's car had broken down. The police said it was an animal attack, something big like a bear or maybe a mountain lion. But the way people talked, they didn't believe it. Benny was torn apart, they said, in ways no animal could have done. I didn't ask too many questions. I didn't want to know. I just kept my head down and tried to focus on work. But the feeling lingered, like something was out there, watching. It was around that time that I started having the dreams, or at least I thought they were dreams at first. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, with the sound of tapping in my ears. The same tapping I'd heard that night in the garage. It was always the same, slow at first, then growing louder and louder until I couldn't stand it. But when I'd wake up, the room would be quiet, still. And I'd sit there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside, waiting for something to happen. And then one night, something did. It was late, must have been past 2 in the morning. I just drifted off when I heard the noise. Not the tapping this time, but something else. Something heavier. Footsteps. I shot out of bed, my heart hammering. The sound was coming from outside, near the front of the house. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was walking around, checking the place out. I grabbed the flashlight I kept by the bed and crept to the window, peeking out just enough to get a look at the yard. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe the wind, maybe a stray dog. But deep down I knew that wasn't it. The footsteps had been too precise, too human. I stood there for a long time, just staring into the dark, half expecting something to come charging out of the woods. But nothing did. Finally, I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I found the prints. They were in the dirt near the side of the house, barefoot, long and thin, too long to be human. But they weren't animal prints either. They were something in between, like a mix of both. My stomach turned when I saw them, and for a split second, I thought about leaving town, just packing up and getting the hell out of there. But where would I go? This was my home. This is where I grew up, where I belonged. So instead of running, I did what I knew best. I got to work. I spent that day in the garage trying to keep myself busy, but the whole time I had this creeping feeling in the back of my mind, like someone was standing just behind me, watching. I'd turn around, but no one was there. My hands were shaking so bad by the time I finished working on the old pickup, I had to sit down for a while just to steady myself. And that's when she came back. I didn't see her at first. I was sitting in the garage, wiping the grease from my hands, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked up, and there she was, Emmy, standing at the edge of the driveway, her hair blowing in the wind, her pale face expressionless. I froze. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I wasn't sure if she was real or if I was losing it. But then she started walking toward me, slow and steady, like nothing had changed, like she hadn't been gone for a week. "Where the hell have you been?" I asked, my voice coming out harsher than I intended. She didn't answer right away. She just stopped a few feet in front of me, her eyes dark and unreadable. "They're still here," she said quietly, "and they're getting closer." I felt my blood run cold. "What are you talking about?" She looked at me, really looked at me, like she was seeing me for the first time. "They're not going to stop. They're going to keep coming. You have to leave." "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice shaking despite myself. "This is my home." She gave me that same sad smile I'd seen before, the one that made me feel like she knew something I didn't. "It's not safe anymore," she said softly. "Not for you. Not for anyone." I wanted to yell at her, to demand answers, but before I could say anything else, she turned and walked away. Just like that. I watched her disappear down the road, her figure swallowed by the trees, and I didn't follow. I didn't know if I could. That night, the tapping came back. It started around midnight, soft at first, just like before. I lay there in bed, my heart racing, listening to it grow louder, faster. The footsteps followed soon after. This time, they weren't outside. They were inside the house. I bolted upright, grabbing the flashlight and stumbling out of bed, my legs shaky. The air in the room was freezing, way too cold for a summer night. I could see my breath in the dim light as I moved down the hall, the tapping and footsteps echoing through the house. I checked the front door, still locked. I checked the windows, no one there. But the sound kept coming, closer and closer, until it felt like it was right behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight down the hallway, and that's when I saw it. Something was standing at the far end of the hall. It was tall, pale, with long, spindly limbs and eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. But it wasn't human. It couldn't be. Its head was too large, its mouth too wide, and the way it moved, it was like it was made of bone and sinew, barely held together by skin. My stomach lurched, and for a second I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen in place, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The thing tilted its head as if studying me, and then it took a step forward. That was all it took. I turned and ran. I don't remember much after that. I must have bolted out of the house and into the garage, because the next thing I knew, I was sitting in the driver's seat of my truck, hands shaking, the keys in the ignition. I didn't even think. I just started the engine and floored it, tearing down the road like my life depended on it. And maybe it did. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up. By the time I finally pulled over, I was miles away from town, parked on the side of some back road I didn't even recognize. I sat there for a long time, staring out the windshield, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but it didn't add up. None of it did. I haven't been back since. I don't know what happened to Emmy or to the town. I've heard rumors, stories of people disappearing, of strange lights in the woods, of whispers carried on the wind, but I don't go looking for answers anymore. Some things are better left alone, and every now and then, late at night, I'll hear it again, that soft, rhythmic tapping, and I'll wonder if they finally found me. But I never look. I just sit there, waiting for it to stop, and it always does, eventually. You never really know someone until you live next to them. It's weird, right? You can pass people in the hallways, smile, maybe even exchange a few words, but you never really know them until the day-to-day starts to reveal things. That's what I learned when I moved into my new place. It's a lesson I won't forget. I was in my late 20s, still figuring things out, like most people my age. After jumping between apartments for a couple of years, I finally landed a decent place. Small, sure, but nice enough. Just 2 units sharing the same building, kind of tucked away from the busy parts of town. I liked the idea of some peace and quiet after dealing with roommates and noisy neighbors for so long. It felt like a step in the right direction. When I first moved in, everything seemed normal. The building had a kind of old-world charm, with worn wooden floors that creaked just a little when you walked, and high windows that let in soft, pale light in the mornings. The air inside smelled faintly of dust and lavender, like it had been around for decades, waiting for people like me to fill it with life again. I liked it. There was a second-floor unit that sat right above mine, and I knew someone lived there. The landlord, an older man with a stiff handshake, mentioned that the tenant had been there for years. He didn't say much else about them, though. I didn't think to ask. I figured it didn't matter. I mean, as long as they were quiet and kept to themselves. I didn't really care. I was ready for my own space. I'd been there for a couple of weeks before I met him, my neighbor. It was early one morning, maybe 6 or 7 a.m., and I was on my way out for a jog. I was locking my door when I heard this soft creak behind me. I turned around, and there he was. He was standing at the top of the narrow stairwell that led to his apartment. I remember thinking he was odd-looking, but not in a way that you'd notice right away. He was a tall man, probably in his late 40s or early 50s, with thinning gray hair that lay flat on his scalp like it hadn't been washed in days. His clothes were neat, but something about the way he wore them, too stiff, like they didn't belong to him. His eyes were what caught me off guard, though. They were a bit too wide, like he was constantly surprised by something. I gave a polite nod, smiled even, but he didn't say anything back. He just stood there at the top of the stairs, watching me with those wide eyes, not moving, not blinking. "Morning," I said, trying to break the weirdness with some small talk. He didn't respond, just stared for a second longer before slowly, so slowly, he nodded. It was like he had to think about how to move his head, like he hadn't done it in a long time. I brushed it off. You meet strange people sometimes, right? No big deal. He was probably just one of those quiet, introverted types who kept to himself. I didn't give it much thought. But after that, things started to feel off. At first, it was little stuff. I'd notice him standing at his window when I came back from work, just standing there, looking out over the street. He wouldn't wave or nod, just stood still, watching. I figured maybe he was lonely or bored. No harm in that, I guess. But then it started happening more frequently. Like every time I left the house or came back, he was there, always at that window, always watching. It wasn't like he was looking at anything specific, just out. And when I'd glance up, I'd catch his eyes, those same wide eyes that seemed just a little too focused, a little too intense. I started to feel uneasy. It's hard to explain why exactly, but the way he watched, it was like he was studying me, like I was a puzzle he was trying to figure out. Every time I left the house, I'd feel this tightness in my chest, a growing tension that built up as I turned the corner and waited to see if he was there, behind the glass, staring, and he usually was. I told myself not to be paranoid. People are weird sometimes. That doesn't mean anything's wrong. But as the days passed, the feeling wouldn't go away. If anything, it got worse. There were times when I'd leave for my jog in the early mornings and I'd hear something behind me, soft footsteps, barely there. I'd turn, but the street was always empty. Still, I could have sworn I was being followed. Then one afternoon, he knocked on my door. It was the middle of a quiet Saturday, and I'd been curled up on the couch, reading. I wasn't expecting anyone, so the knock startled me. I stood there for a second, staring at the door, wondering if I should even answer. It knocked again, this time slower, more deliberate. When I opened it, there he was. He was standing there, too close to the doorway, his eyes wide, of course, and his mouth slightly open, like he was about to say something but couldn't quite get the words out. The awkwardness was palpable. "Hi," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can I help you?" There was this long pause where he just kept looking at me like he was waiting for me to say something else. Finally, he spoke. "Would you like to go for a walk?" His voice was low, flat, almost mechanical, like he wasn't used to using it. I hesitated, my stomach doing a little flip. No thanks. I'm kind of busy right now." He didn't respond right away. His head tilted slightly, and his eyes narrowed, as if he was trying to understand why I said no. For a second, I thought maybe I should have been nicer. Maybe he was lonely, maybe he just wanted some company. But then he said something that made my skin crawl. "We'll go for a walk later, maybe tonight." It wasn't a question. He said it like it was a fact, something inevitable. I forced a polite smile and nodded, just to end the conversation, and closed the door as quickly as I could without seeming rude. But once I was alone again, the tension hit me like a weight. Something wasn't right. That interaction, it felt wrong on so many levels, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. After that, the encounters became more frequent. I'd find him standing in front of my door when I got home from work, just standing there, not knocking, not saying anything, just waiting. His requests for walks grew more insistent, though he never forced himself into my space. There was always this strange politeness to him, like he thought what he was doing was normal, like we were friends. But the way he looked at me, it was unnerving. One night, I came home late after grabbing dinner with a friend, and he was there again, waiting just outside the front entrance. I tried to ignore him, to keep my head down and get inside as fast as I could, but he called my name. I stopped, not because I wanted to, but because of the way he said it. It wasn't loud or angry. It was soft, almost pleading. Against my better judgment, I turned around. "Why won't you go for a walk with me?" he asked, his voice strained. There was something different in his eyes this time, an intensity I hadn't seen before. It was like a mix of frustration and desperation. "I don't really know you," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, though my heart was racing. "It's not personal. We live together," he interrupted. "We share this space. We're connected." The way he said that, connected, sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, frozen, as he stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. "I'll see you later," he said finally, and turned around, walking slowly back to his apartment. I didn't move until I heard the door click shut behind him. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, wondering what he meant by connected. The word echoed in my mind, twisting into something dark and unsettling. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, probably around midnight, and I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. The building was silent, as it usually was at that hour, but there was something in the air that felt wrong. The kind of quiet that felt too thick, too oppressive, like the silence was pressing down on me. And then I heard it, a soft creak from the hallway outside my door. At first I thought I was imagining it. I lay there, perfectly still, listening, my heart pounding in my ears. Another creak, then another. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving closer to my door. My breath caught in my throat as the footsteps stopped, and I heard the faintest sound, like a hand brushing against the wood. I sat up in bed, my skin prickling with fear. Someone was outside my door. For a long moment, I didn't move. I couldn't. I was paralyzed, listening to the silence, waiting for the next sound. Then, softly, I heard it, the quiet, unmistakable sound of the doorknob turning. I bolted out of bed and grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp from my bedside table. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I stood there, waiting, watching the doorknob turn slowly, inch by inch. And then it stopped. The air was so thick with tension I could barely breathe. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The doorknob didn't move again. The footsteps didn't come back. Slowly, I crept toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest, and pressed my ear against it. Silence. I waited a few more minutes before I finally worked up the courage to open the door. My hand trembled as I turned the knob, and when I opened it, the hallway was empty. But there, on the floor just outside my door, was a note. It was folded neatly in half, with my name written on the front in shaky, uneven letters. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I unfolded it. Inside, written in the same shaky handwriting, were two words: "We're connected." I slammed the door shut, locked it, and spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch with every light in the apartment on, clutching that damn lamp like it was the only thing keeping me safe. I moved out the next day. Didn't even wait for the lease to be up. I packed what I could carry and left, leaving behind everything else: furniture, dishes, even some clothes. I didn't care. I just had to get out of there. I never saw him again, and I never want to. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about him. About the way he looked at me, like we shared some secret I didn't understand, like we were connected in some way I couldn't escape. And no matter where I go, no matter how far I run, I'll never shake the feeling that he's still watching, waiting. Because maybe, just maybe, we really are connected.